My name is Carla Mercado, and I am the Senior Manager of Public Policy and Philanthropy California. Philanthropy California is the statewide alliance of Northern California grantmakers, Southern California grantmakers, and San Diego grantmakers. We are regional associations of foundations across the state, and we are very proud to be part of the California Policy Forum. The California Policy Forum is a partnership between Cal Nonprofits and the League of California Community Foundations. We love this partnership because it creates a space for philanthropy and nonprofits to come together and discuss timely policy issues that not only impact our sectors, but the communities that we care about. And speaking of timely issues, Redistricting 2021, and you'll learn a lot more about it and its connection to the census and why, one, we need to start now preparing, two, what's already happening on the ground, and three, how can we look and engage and prepare for 2021 redistricting. But before that, I would like to hand it back to Christina, who is going to go over a few housekeeping and technicalities for you to consider. Thank you.
Okay, so today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to everybody who registers by the end of this week. All participants' phones are muted. As I said, we had more than 200 people register for today, so you can imagine the chaos that would be if we could hear everybody's backgrounds. Please use the Q&A box. If you could find that Q&A box, please use that for questions today for your panelists. We are not using that raise your hand feature because people are muted, and the chat box is where you should put any technical issues, also any resources that get mentioned during the webinar, we'll put those in the chat box. So just so you know, there's the two boxes, the Q&A box and the chat box, and the Q&A box is the one where you should put your questions for presenters. I do recommend that you screenshot this or write down these phone numbers and the webinar ID 463-066-613 so that in case you get disconnected from the audio or the entire webinar itself, you can call in and still be able to hear everybody. And that's it for our housekeeping. So next I want to introduce Amy Dominguez Arms from Philanthropy California. She is our moderator today. So take it away, Amy.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us for this conversation on redistricting, which is a topic that can seem wonky perhaps and removed from day-to-day concerns, but is really central to how communities will fare in the decade ahead. Redistricting is the generally once-a-decade process by which districts are created in which communities will be represented in Congress, in the state legislatures, school boards, and in their city councils. And our presenters today are going to provide insights on how redistricting works in California, what's at stake for communities, and how each of you in your various roles can exercise a role in assuring that all Californians have an equal voice in our public decision-making bodies. And for those of you who are representing foundations or funders, you may be interested in learning more about a fair representation fund housed here at Philanthropy California, in which we are just getting launched, and the purpose of the fund really is to bring funders together to support community engagement in redistricting in California. So if you're interested, please be in touch afterwards. We have a terrific panel today. I'm so thrilled they could all be a part of this. And what we've asked is for each to spend about 7 or 8 minutes in providing some opening remarks to leave really plenty of time for questions and dialogue with all of you. So I'm just going to go through and introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll turn it over to them to get started. So first, our first speaker will be Connie Malloy. Connie's Executive Director of the Pantarea Foundation and is finishing up her term as a commissioner with the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. Connie's also someone with whom I had the great pleasure of working together for a number of years as we were both on the California Democracy team at the James Irvine Foundation. Arti Kohli is Executive Director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, serving low-income Asian Pacific American communities. Advancing Asian Law Caucus is based in the Bay Area, but has partnerships and networks throughout the state and a statewide impact in terms of their work. Anthony Thigpen is founder and president of California Calls, which is a growing alliance of 31 community-based organizations across the state working to make California's electorate reflect our diverse population. And California Calls is also home to the Black Census and Redistricting Hub, which is really exercising a leadership role in engaging the Black community statewide in these important processes. And finally, Efrain Escobedo is Vice President of Education and Immigration at California Community Foundation. And Efrain brings experience from the nonprofit realm through his work, previous work at NALEO, National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, and in the public realm through his work with the LA County Registrar and Recorder's Office, and now in philanthropy. So again, thanks to all of our presenters who are here today, and I'll turn it to Connie to start us off.
Sure, thank you, and so glad to be talking about this topic. So as Amy started to share, every 10 years, we take the new census data that comes down from the census count, and we divide the country and all the states in it into political districts. This process is called redistricting for those who are kind of in the mix. You'll also hear it referred to as line drawing or as mapping. Even though we are all taught to think that we choose our elected officials, it was quite eye-opening for me personally to realize that historically our elected officials have been the ones who've been choosing their voters. And the way that they've done that is through controlling the redistricting process and often behind closed doors, negotiating amongst themselves over which voters and which communities they want to have within their political districts. Oftentimes their goals are to keep their seats safe, to make sure that a given incumbent or candidate doesn't really have to compete with anybody else, or that a seat remains with the party that historically it has been with. But I'm happy to say that in 2011, California took a stand and said, we're going to do this differently. And there had been two ballot initiatives that had passed prior to that, the Voters First acts. And what they did was they set up a different path forward. They said, let's take the power away from the legislatures. It's clearly a conflict of interest for an elected official to essentially choose their voters. And so we're going to have a citizens commission, everyday people who have no connection to the political process, to be able to draw the state's political maps. And California was the first in the nation to reform redistricting on this level. And so it was a big experiment that nationally was watched and continues to be watched on, is it working, and how applicable would this work in other states? So I applied to be on the commission because I had seen firsthand the roles that decision makers play on all of the things I care about, whether it was, our public education, our jobs and workforce, the environment. And I put my name in along with tens of thousands of other Californians, and was surprised to find out I was going to be one of the first commissioners. Let's put up that first picture that I have. So this is a picture of the commission. We're on the tail end year, going into year 10 of our 10-year term. 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independent voters from very different regions of the states, cultures, professional backgrounds, etc. And we had to figure out what it meant to apply this big lofty goal of reforming how redistricting was done in the state of California. So on the day that we were sworn in to our roles, the clock started ticking, and we had 8 months to be able to take the state's Assembly, Senate, Congressional, and Board of Equalization districts and draw 177 maps, including an analysis of why we drew each of the maps the way that we decided to draw it. We did have a set of voter-approved criteria that we had to follow in ranked order. The most common one that everyone knows is equal population, essentially one person, one vote. So we had to have districts that all were the same size. And there were a number of other criteria. But one of the most important roles that the commission played, I believe, was that we had to take the hard numbers, the census data that we had, And we needed to be able to layer that with people's everyday lived experience. And what was the story behind the numbers? What were the kind of groupings of communities of interest, people that live nearby each other that may share things in common that really matter when it comes to political representation? And how are we going to do that? We really had to get out there and listen. And so the commission, with the very limited budget that we had, we decided to do a set of 34 hearings from the north part of the state all the way to the southern part of the state. And then in between the hearings, we were constantly receiving feedback, emails, map submissions, all kinds of different media to be able to inform the work that we were doing. We had, through that process, we developed the maps. We did it on time and under budget, in no small part because philanthropy played a role in making sure that there was a diversity of voices that were part of that first process. And there's a number of things that I'm proud about from that process. I mean, we have this here, you can see, this is what it actually looked like to be, from my perspective, where I was as a commissioner looking out into the audience at one of our hearings. And there's so many examples across the state of communities of interest that had previously been fragmented. The Vietnamese community in Southern California that had been split into multiple districts and so couldn't really get a fair shake when it came to accessing their representatives. There were economic areas. The grape growing regions of Northern California in some cases had been split across the growers and the packers, and just so much wealth of information and nuance behind the census data. We have gotten testimony around how there are parts of the state where new electeds that we have now or candidates would never have even gotten to have a fair shake running for office, much less actually getting a chance to lead. And that there's communities that they never really were able to get a call back or access to their elected official because there was just no incentive. The seat was safe. The person that was representing them really didn't have a stake in the game in making themselves accessible. And so I think for me, it was an important lesson in knowing that everyday people who used common sense and a set of criteria we all agreed on were able to change this process in a way that was more fair and more inclusive. Let's do that next photo, please. This was a picture from the day that we had to present the final maps and to certify the maps. And this was a public event, and we had to have a 2-week waiting period once we finalized them for the public to comment and before we took that final vote. So there's much more I could say on redistricting. But what I'll close with are just what are some of the key opportunities to get involved. And I'm speaking with my commissioner hat, not my funder hat today. The first is just a quiz. Do you actually know when and how your local redistricting happens? Your city council, your school board, whatever the districts are that really matter to you, where decisions are made that impact your life, would really encourage you to find out when and how that redistricting happens, because that will shape the form of your leadership for the coming decade. The second is to spread the word. And unfortunately, redistricting, despite the impact that it has, it only gets airtime once every 10 years. So now's the moment, and it's our opportunity to be able to share with our colleagues, with our families, with our friends, what redistricting is and how we can help to shape it. We still have a little bit of time before this current set of commissioners, myself, will sunset in about a year next summer. And when that new commission comes in, they will be the ones having a round of hearings all across the state and inviting testimony from the public as to what matters to them for effective representation. So being prepared on what communities you're going to be a part of testifying with, and to have this on your radar is really critical. And the last that I'll say is that California was the first out the gate, but redistricting reform has been one of the hottest topics on a national level. And there's a handful of other states that have passed redistricting reforms that they are figuring out how to implement. And so part of my work now is going to other states and being a support to them as they figure out what from California's model can be replicated or what might need to be just wholly new and envisioned in that local context. census. But you may have relatives, you may have friends, you may have colleagues that are in other parts of the country. And so to really be supportive and tracking and aware of what's happening in other places and how we might be able to influence and ensure that those efforts are also a success. So I'll end there with this photo of the moment where we signed and made those maps official for California, and look forward to any questions you might have later.
Thanks, Connie. This is Arti Kohli. I also want to thank Amy and others for organizing this webinar. I completely agree that this is kind of a sleeper issue, but one that is incredibly important for all of us who are trying to build power in our communities. As Amy mentioned, I work at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus that's based in San Francisco, but we do both statewide and national work across a range of areas. So for Asian Americans, the need is pretty acute because we remain underrepresented in federal government, in state government, and local government. And we are the fastest growing minority community in the state and the nation. And so we're really trying to figure out how we step forward, both as an organization and in partnership with allies and communities, to demand districts that really result in our political empowerment. And we know that if we don't do it now, we're just going to fall further behind over the course of the next decade as our community grows. So, you know, if we want to build a California democracy that looks like the state, then Asian American voices really have to be a part of this next redistricting cycle. We have some unique challenges because we aren't often big enough in terms of the size of our communities in any given jurisdiction to take advantages of the protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which does mandate that majority minority districts be drawn when communities are large, residentially concentrated, and blocked from electing representation by racially polarized voting. So what we have to do if we want to influence districts, if we want influence districts, coalition districts, or crossover districts, we really have to get organized, get unified, turn out to the commission meetings as you saw in the photos that were just shared. And that is pretty labor intensive. So we are planning with partners like Advancing Justice Los Angeles to support Asian American communities across the state with legal support, with mapping support, and critically with the organizing support we will all need to fight for the districts that we feel like our community really deserves. So the next point I want to make is we all have some challenges ahead, not just Asian American advocates. And you know, this was referred to, but I think we just really have to think about this. Our organization works on 6 different program issues, including deportation defense, and even our civic engagement work includes voting rights, census, and redistricting. So as we've tried to drum up interest in the California Redistricting Commission and tried to talk with community partners about their plans to engage on redistricting, we're finding, and this is completely understandable given the stress on our organizations and communities at this moment, redistricting is the last thing on everyone's mind right now. And folks are just working their tails off on the 2020 census, elections, including on some key ballot measures that are going to be on the November ballot. I think a lot of us are terrified of what will happen if the census goes wrong, and we're doing what we can to make sure it goes right. And for some of us, you know, civic engagement is just a small part of all the different things that we do. So, you know, our partner organizations that have to provide basic services, housing, any number of critical things have limited time to contribute to civic engagement. So we want to make sure that our field of advocates, lawyers, mappers, and donors we're all ready by November 4th, 2020. So that the day after the election, we can capture all the energy that went to the census and to the elections and to direct that towards redistricting. And we want to work with you all to figure out how to make that happen. We know that folks need resources and education needs to happen with partners and funders, and which is one of the reasons, I'm so happy to be part of this webinar. A further impediment that we've been thinking about, and it's going to be relevant a little further down the road that I want to quickly mention, is that our organization has been working with historically disenfranchised communities when their cities undergo California Voting Rights Act transitions. So this is what happens when a city moves from at-large elections to district elections, which is, often really great for minority communities because then they get more representation. And we see that people are much more aware of gerrymandering now than they have been in the past. And particularly from when the last California Citizens Redistricting Commission was doing its work a decade ago. And so we outreach to community leaders and say, we can help you ensure that you can get new city council districts that empower you instead of gerrymandering you. And some, not all, get it right off the bat. And while it's great that people are now attuned to the issue, it's also clear that people don't know the difference between redistricting and gerrymandering. Any squiggly boundary, any weird corner, any odd shape is automatically suspicious and considered possible gerrymandering. Well, the reality is this is actually the standard business of drawing good maps. We don't want districts that are simple, geometric shapes, because our communities don't live in clear boxes. Districts that actually represent our communities will not be, and actually don't have to be, ultra compact or simple squares. So what's hard is we are getting serious pushback on this from community members who don't come from our communities. They see any district that does work to keep our communities together and cry gerrymandering. So we're going to have to work extra hard to overcome this. And then I think the last thing I want to just emphasize is that, we've built this amazing infrastructure in California around the census. And we have county coalitions, regional coalitions, and statewide coalitions. And I would love to work with you all to really harness all that energy, all that work that's gone into that infrastructure, and put it to use for redistricting so that we can all build power together. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it off to Anthony Thigpen.
Thanks, Artie. Good afternoon, everyone. So Connie and Artie both talked about the importance of community engagement in the redistricting process. I'm going to provide a particular example of an approach to community involvement, looking at the challenges in the African American community in the redistricting process. A number of issues have arose or accelerated over the last 10 years as it relates to the Black community. Gentrification, the lack of affordable housing, displacement, changing neighborhood demographics have all caused migration and disbursement of African American communities from the traditional geographic areas and communities of interest. And this both affects political representation in traditional high concentration areas like South LA or Oakland or Richmond, but also in areas with increasing African American populations like San Diego, the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, County, Sacramento, and Stockton, where African Americans are not the majority in these potential political districts, but have clear communities of interest that need to be taken into account as you draw lines and not dividing communities, et cetera. It's also critically important that community members know about redistricting and its impact on them, their families, and communities before it happens, not after the fact, and that they have their voices heard and have a sense they have an active role in this process itself. So the Black Census and Redistricting Hub came about to try to address some of these challenges. The Hub sees the census and redistricting as two stages of the same process. So the Hub has been doing major outreach, education, and organizing in 6 areas of the state with significant African American populations around the census. This includes direct outreach to hard-to-count populations, canvassing, phoning, traditional media, and social media to make people aware of both the census, but it's only the first part of the process itself. The Hub has also done coalition building. We've organized a coalition of over 30 organizations in these 6 areas of the state, and are doing outreach to institutional leaders and organizations in the African American communities in these 6 areas. A big focus has been education and training. The Hub has done and is doing a series of training to community members, both around the census and the redistricting process. And the first step is just to make people aware that this is taking place and why they should care. Another key piece of the work is to develop the technical expertise and capacities needed in both the census stage and the redistricting stage. This includes database development and management, GIS mapping, the ability to actually draw lines, and legal expertise. The Hub's working with UCLA Bunch Center, USC Peer, the Advancement Project, and a core of other academics and experts to develop that expertise, and I'll say why I think that's important in a second. Over the last several months, the Hub has worked to make people aware of the Redistricting Commission process. As Connie mentioned, there's sunsetting, and the process has already begun to choose new commissioners. So first, we want to make sure people are aware of that. We've also been working with applicants to help guide them through the process itself. We've been involved in a number of collaborations, including the Census Planning and Advocacy Network, the Redistricting Collaborative, and in discussions about a unity map that would try to avoid the kind of conflicts that we have seen in past redistricting efforts. Finally, we've developed a 4-phase process around redistricting that started this summer and goes through the line drawing and decision-making and final vote in 2021. And our focus is developing an informed, active, effective participation from community members and organizations, both in the statewide redistricting process, but also in the various redistricting processes that happen at the local level itself. And let me conclude by saying that our goal for redistricting ought to be a unity map. That's very complex and very difficult thing to achieve. To achieve that, we think requires the various communities of interest to come to that discussion as equal partners. That means having the technical expertise and done the needed community engagement, education, and organizing, and that's the mission of the Black Hub. And I'll turn it over to Efrain.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation and to be able to lend just a few perspectives that help maybe tie this conversation and kick us off into more of a robust discussion. As Amy mentioned, I serve as our Vice President supporting our education and immigration initiatives at the California Community Foundation. We're a place-based community foundation serving specifically the communities of Los Angeles County. And as we think about our work around supporting greater civic participation, supporting the 2020 census and its critical impact on our communities, we start to then look at redistricting in a whole different light. And what I wanted to share is sort of what is the role of philanthropy in helping to complete, per se, the transformative process that came about as a result of the voters moving California to a citizen-driven redistricting process, which I think Connie did a phenomenal job of really explaining not just what is the process, what was the role of the commission, but the impact it's really had in California, first and foremost by reducing the partisan hold over the redistricting process by political parties, and really ceding the responsibility of that to the community, which, as we saw in 2011, led to greater community voice. And I think that as philanthropy, we need to realize that in order to then fully realize the potential of what that process means for creating a greater voice for communities, really advancing an agenda of equity for California, which we've seen great promise in, and to really realize the vision that Anthony shared of creating unity maps, creating greater collaboration between communities to have an equal voice and really impacting this process. The reality is those are all muscles that need to be built. There's been tremendous transformation that's happened in California as a result of the collaboration between community and philanthropy in building an integrated voter engagement infrastructure in California that's really increased the participation of traditionally excluded and low voter participation communities here in California. Participation in the redistricting process and community voice in that is something that needs to be built into that. And it requires partnership and support for us to do it. We had a great run in it in 2010, but as we look at 2020, organization like California Community Foundation is asking ourselves, how do we support the community then really taking advantage and fully leveraging its voice in the redistricting process, as we know that it is just as important as having a complete count in the census. And the census really is the launching pad for setting the stage of what we'll be able to accomplish in the redistricting process. Our colleague Artie at Asian Law Caucus, I think, really identified some key threats that we should all be looking at and thinking about that may impact the success of the 2020 redistricting process. First and foremost, obviously, is the question of a census with high differential undercounts, meaning a lot of more underserved communities, high need communities, communities of color, having high undercount rates being missed by a census that maybe was not as inclusive as past census, a census that is now more digital, that maybe was less accessible for a lot of communities that face more barriers and challenges. And second of all, is seeing a recruitment process that concluded for people applying to be part of the Citizen Redistricting Commission. We saw that there was a need for high outreach. The application periods were extended to ensure a higher level of participation. And so what that commission looks like, we will learn more about as the year progresses. But those two threats are critical in us thinking about, well, what does that mean for our redistricting process? And as we look at those threats, things that have come up for us is it makes our engagement and partnership in redistricting all the more important, because high undercounts mean more people not being included in the census, meaning their opportunity to not lose equal representation and have an opportunity to decide how their communities are represented is going to rely in the redistricting process, turning out, being a voice at the meetings that we saw images of in Connie's presentation. The higher the undercount, the more community voice that's going to be needed in the redistricting process. And so going into 2020-21, we're highly sensitive to that fact. And I think as philanthropy and engaging colleagues in how best to support our communities, not just in achieving a fair census, but ensuring that that translates into a fair and equitable redistricting process is very important. And as I've shared with colleagues, as we're thinking about what does that partnership look like going into 2020, 2021, is the fact that the redistricting process is only as political as the participation of the community in that process. The less the community voice, the more political and partisan the process. And so the more we uplift that, the fairer process that we'll have. Again, it's tremendously beneficial to be part of this conversation. It was great to hear all of the presentations prior and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Efrain, Anthony, Connie, and Arti. Really great opening comments. Why don't you all come back on video, and we will now start the Q&A period. And so I'll list off a few of the questions we've already received. I really want to encourage people on the call, though, to put your questions in. Redistricting is complicated. I have a lot of questions. I imagine folks on the call have a lot of questions. So please start typing them in, but I'll tee up a couple that have come in. And Connie, I'm going to throw the first one to you. Patricia Solario writes that our city just had our first district elections in 2018. What's typical in local redistricting timing? Does it occur after the state redistricting or simultaneously? So good question. And what do you know, Connie?
Well, I know that it's actually been evolving. And so I'm going to ask Arti to weigh in on that because there's been some new legislation that will, play a role in the timing.
Sure. So my understanding is that it'll start after, and it starts mid-2021. And the legislation that Connie's mentioning is AB 849, the Fair Maps Act. And it's really, it's great legislation, which bolsters up so, a lot of the federal legislation is just around congressional districts. So this is about local districts. And what it requires, do you want me to share what the legislation does?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it says that cities and counties have to draw districts that are substantially equal in population. And so obviously we have to follow all the federal rules with, has to follow what the US Constitution says, the California Constitution says, and the voting rights says. But in addition to that, to the extent possible, it says that there has to be geographic contiguity. So each district has to be one whole shape with a single continuous border. There has to be minimal division of communities of interest and local neighborhoods, minimal division of cities and census designated places, that's for the county, easily identifiable district boundaries that follow natural or artificial barriers or street, and geographic compactness. So additionally, it's not permitted to favor or discriminate against a political party. And I think this is a really great part, which is the cities and counties have to do the following that is all about public participation, outreach, translation. They have to have at least 4 redistricting hearings before adopting a new district map. I mean, these kinds of things rarely happen. So these are great requirements which gave opportunities to local communities to engage. They have to conduct outreach to local media, including ethnic media. They have to make good faith efforts to notify local government, civic engagement, civil rights, and community groups. They have to provide live translation in applicable languages at redistricting hearings. They have to give public notice 5 days in advance, things like that. So that's AB 849, the Fair Maps Act.
Great. And I know in our recent conversation, RT, your organization was thinking about putting together a one-pager or something for folks. And so that's something we could send out to people on the call.
Yeah, I have it. And we will, I'll send it to you, Amy, and you can feel free, we can distribute it to folks. Yeah.
Great. All right. Thank you, folks. Questions are coming in. Next one I'm going to put your way, Efrain. Here's you have a couple coming your way. The first one is, what would be the most effective funding that a charitable foundation could provide to help the 2020 census count to be the most accurate?
Sorry, I was
Efrain.
there. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think in terms of 2020 census, the first is funding now. I think that the postcards for the census will be going out in March. And so a number of organizations are looking at starting their work now because of the early education with the digital census. And so being able to have the agility to make investments December and into January is critical for those resources to make a difference for organizations. There isn't per se a statewide fund, as we're being very strategic now to do for redistricting, but the state has divided, the state office of the census has divided California into 8 regions. That's all public information that looks at how is the census being resourced in terms of outreach by the state. And that should give philanthropic organizations an understanding of, one, what regions are those that I serve, communities that I serve, and all of those have local tables and an administrative CBO that is helping to distribute resources. So I would encourage you to do that. As an example, LA County being the hardest county to count in California, CCF is serving as the administrative CBO. So the opportunity that creates is for other philanthropic organizations to reach out to us and be able to get their resources out, as we've already been doing with state dollars. So I would encourage folks to identify who the administrative CBO is in the communities that you support and reach out and contact those individuals.
Great, thank you. And while you have the floor, Efrain, I'll put one more to you. This question, and this is a tough one, you know, are the immigration threats by the federal government going to affect Hispanics from participating in the census? I know it's something on the minds of many of us, but Efrain, do you want to address that?
Absolutely, thanks, Amy, and thank you for uplifting that. It's always important to identify our most vulnerable in the different processes we're trying to affect. But it's a tough answer, but it's an easy one, and that's yes. Yes, it is going to affect the participation of our immigrant communities. The fear is real, it's palpable. Our job and work in working with partners across the state is going to be sort of dispelling that fear, providing as much information as we can to try and at least minimize and mitigate the impact on the census.
Thank you. And, you know, Anthony, I wanted to put a question to you. RT had raised this issue, which is very real, of the pressure on nonprofits in 2020, community-based organizations that care about an accurate census count, that want to turn out, make sure that their communities turn out to vote, that while redistricting happens in early 2021, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in 2020 to start the conversation. How are you all, and the many, you know, you work with nonprofits throughout the state of varying sizes and capacity, how are people balancing that?
Well, yeah, I think the first thing, I think several people have said it, is to start early. Think about a plan and start early so that we're not rushed to try to get everything done at the end. The other thing is that there are a number of entities, coalitions, and collaborations that are happening right now, so that one CBO or one community doesn't feel like they have to do it all themselves or feel guilty, because they can't do it all themselves. So to the degree that people involved in these collaborations, these various regional and statewide tables, it allows us to maximize the effectiveness. So I think the most important thing is starting early. Pace yourself, because everything can't be done at once. But if you have a good plan, first, in the early parts of the census, preparing for redistricting, and then when redistricting kicks into high gear, you can pace yourself and become involved in that and build the capacities to do that.
Great, thank you. And here's a question, whoever wants to take it. It's a very good one about communications. And the question relates to communications with regard to testing messages about making oneself counted for the census. But I guess, and so I know there's a lot of work going on in many different communities around message testing and what works and what doesn't. So anyone who wants to share some information on that, or also even more broadly, given what a busy year 2020 is, how do you kind of cut through the noise and get messages to communities about what's important in terms of their participation? So whoever on the panel wants to take a communication. Go, Anthony, yeah.
So I'd say a couple of things. I know we and others did some message testing over the summer in preparation for the involvement in the census itself. Because we know that the message has to be tailored to particular communities and also the different types of hard-to-count populations. A message to a young person might be very different than someone who's homeless, as an example. So being clear on the different hard-to-count populations and being very self-conscious about very specific messages to them and testing that out and being flexible, because you'll learn from those tests in terms of fine-tuning what works itself.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to note I'm also involved with some census efforts nationally, and I've just been impressed by so many groups who are being so thoughtful and sophisticated about the messaging. And as you said, Anthony, I think this point about iterating on messages, you know, it's not like you do a poll once or a focus group in November and then there's your message. Just as one example, United We Dream, an organization I know many of us are familiar with, is doing some very sophisticated message testing through their digital, social media, Facebook, and really seeing what comes back, who responds to what, tailoring, retailoring, and just really has planned an ongoing iterative process throughout the census season, because again, circumstances will change and people will have different concerns as it goes on. So I think that iterative approach is really important. Artie, did you?
I was just going to add that one of the things that we have been actually doing communications on, we were actually thinking of creating a video. It's not just like for communities, which we are doing, but actually for community leaders. Because they are feeling, I think, a lot of the stress of, like, you know, we work with Muslim communities that have been surveilled, like, you know, can I say to my community that they should, you know, sign up? And so for community leaders, what we've been outlining for them is the confidentiality protections that are part of the census, that are quite robust, that have been put in because of past mistakes. And so this is, I think, a piece for community leaders to really fully understand and be comfortable with. And so that's been one area we felt has been important to emphasize with our partners.
And the other quick point, Amy, is this: it's both content, but it's also vehicles. Think about the multiple ways that we need to communicate. And again, that varies depending on the community and the hard-to-count population itself. So it's both experimenting with the language that's necessary, but also how do you get it out to people in the way they're going to listen to them.
Yep, great.
Yeah, Amy, I was just going to.
Did you want to? Yeah, go.
I was just going to add, sort of making a tie to the redistricting piece is something that's been, you know, in a very difficult census, something that's been very beneficial was that a lot of this message testing started early, and we've been looking at how it's evolved, building around it, starting early education. I think as we think about redistricting, that's actually an area where, aside from 2010, we have not really constructed good messaging around why is it important for an individual citizen to participate in a citizen-driven process. it's usually been testing around how to fight against gerrymandering, how to fight against unfair districts, but not in a proactive way of this impacts you. And I don't know if Connie has any perspectives on it, but it's important that we take a similar strategy with redistricting, I think, and really early start to invest in the messages around engaging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you teeing that up. And I'll just say that, you know, nobody in Sacramento likes these pesky citizens that come to redraw their districts now. So the budget that we are given and kind of the ability of citizens to actually do this work is very constrained. And once redistricting starts, literally that clock starts ticking, and the commission is not there to do public education. And that was a hard lesson to learn. As somebody who has really like come up through doing community work, we did not have the resources to be able, nor the time to be able to do that and to actually get the maps done in the way they needed to be done. And so the ability to build off of the existing coalitions, networks, census messaging that's happened and start to foreshadow what's on the horizon with redistricting is really critical, because once that process actually starts to kick off, it is a very compressed process and timeline. And so the gearing up is actually happening, needs to happen somewhat now in a way that is complementary to the census efforts, both in order for organizations to be able to use the limited bandwidth they have most efficiently, but also so that organizations can plug in at those critical moments when information is being gathered, when lines literally are being drawn on maps in open session, because once those moments pass, those lines get set, and then additional maps get drawn around it, and it gets very difficult, if not impossible, to undo. So I think it's really foresightful that this group is thinking about that. There was a coalition that was funded almost entirely by the James Irvine Foundation under Amy's thoughtful leadership many years ago that did come together and do some work around messaging within the different communities that each of those organizations were operating in. And so I think the world has changed since then, and politics have changed since then. And so the ability to revisit those and see what still makes sense and what needs to be new, this would be the great time to do that.
Thanks, Connie. That's really helpful. And I also wanted to ask you a related question. I mean, as you reflect on who came to the Redistricting Commission hearings and meetings in the last cycle, are there reflections you have either about, what was very positive and you were really glad to see, what you felt was lacking? What would be your hope for the type of participation in this cycle that comes up that's either similar to or builds on what you saw in the last round?
Mm-hmm. We were blown away, I think, as a commission, given that we barely knew what redistricting was. Once there was a bit of awareness around the opportunity to weigh in on redistricting, there was just more demand than we were prepared for. And we would book, meeting halls in different cities, and we would say, be planning for 3 or 4 hours of testimony, and we'd have enough people there to want to go late into the night to do 6 hours of testimony. Now, I think that may have been unique because it was the first time this process had ever happened, and you also didn't have this very polarized political environment in which there was this climate of fear. I think that is a really significant development that has happened that may have an impact on kind of the volume and form of the testimony. But this is really where I think this audience is unique, of nonprofit leaders, where you have a set of clients, you have a set of trusted relationships and partners that not only is it about individuals saying what they care about, it's also about making sense and integrating that data in larger scale and numbers. And so the ability for nonprofit leaders to be able to tee up some of your leaders and networks to speak with a collective voice is also really important, because it helps to protect those who are not legally in a position to be putting themselves out on Front Street, but where they have really critical things at stake in this process. And so I would love to see more more engagement from the nonprofit sector, not just organizations who specialize in voter and civic engagement, who are near and dear to my heart, but also those of you who have this broader base and network and organizations who, whether it's provide health services, engage people in the arts, you name it, the leadership that comes from these districts is going to affect all of us.
Thank you so much. So we just have about 3 or 4 minutes left. I just want to see if any of the speakers have, want to raise a point that you may feel wasn't raised earlier. Maybe just a minute each if you haven't, don't feel like you need to, and then we will wrap up.
Amy, I'll just share something that came up briefly, and I think Artie spoke to it a bit, and it was part of the questions, is a reminder that because of the California Voting Rights Act, there are a number of local municipalities, whether it's community college districts, school boards, or cities, who for the first time will be doing a sort of non-court mandated redrawing of maps. And with the new bill that Artie shared at AB 849, we should really just be monitoring that closely, because there were some changes to that because of the Voting Rights Act. So a number of cities will be doing that for the first time this go around.
Great point. I'm glad you said that. Anthony?
Yeah, I would just say investing early now is probably most critical to get ahead of the game. I think Efrain may have said that the shorter the time compression, the more conflict and the more political it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mentioned in my presentation that the gold star is a unity map. That's not going to be easy, but that ought to be our goal. The more time we have to plan, to engage, to have conversations early and not late, the better that becomes a possibility. So investment in that planning and early outreach, I think, is critical for success.
Yeah, I will.
Great point.
I'll just chime in and say, I totally second that. I completely agree with Anthony that we really have to work well together to build that unity map. I'll also say, because I used to work on the Hill, I worked for Congress, I worked in DC, and I still do some national work. Where California leads, others will follow. So we have to remember that we're not just about building power for our communities here who are vulnerable, but there are a lot of communities outside of California who don't even have the support that we have here, and that we really, can create a model. I think we already have, but we build and perfect this model that we've created here. I think it'll be beneficial for the whole country.
Thank you. Connie, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll underscore that the national lens is just so critical. We had some of the critics at a national level say, well, California had this one-hit wonder with the Redistricting Commission, and this cycle is the opportunity to show, no, this can be done. Yes, citizens can take control of their democracy and do it in a fair way, and to be able to show those other states that are just taking the first baby step to their redistricting reform that there is hope and a different way of doing this kind of work. And so all of us who've been on this call now, the ask from my end would just be to be ambassadors around redistricting. Don't assume anybody cares what redistricting is, but think about your networks and the people in your life and what they do care about and how redistricting connects to that, and use that as your point of entry for those conversations or for that work that might evolve.
Well, I want to thank all of our terrific panelists. I know I learned a lot, and thanks to all of you who participated. I see we have a few kind of census-related questions in the Q&A. I'll answer those right away, but I think at this we'll be concluding the call. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.